Everyone laughed when she bought every crooked chicken until her stewed supper made a line. The morning of the sale, there were 53 chickens that the commercial breeders in Callaway County had decided were not worth the feed it took to keep them breathing. Not because they were diseased, not because they had reached the end of their laying cycles, because they were wrong. And along the limestone ridges of western Kentucky, wrong meant worthless, and worthless meant the auctioneer would drop the price until somebody, anybody, took them off his hands before sundown. An imperfect bird consumed the same grain as a prize-winning Plymouth Rock, but it offered nothing to display at the county fair. It represented a leak in the bucket. The auctioneer, an old man named Clellum Vance, who was no relation to Clara despite the shared surname, intended to seal that leak before the sun cleared the top of the silo at 10 a.m. They stood in 6 rusted wire crates stacked 3 high along the damp east wall of Dunbar's livestock barn. Every single one of them had something the others didn't. A twisted claw that dragged awkwardly in the cedar sawdust. A crooked beak that met at an angle so sharp it looked like a pair of misaligned tin shears. A wing that sat lower than it ought to, hanging limp against a bare rib cage. One young pullet had a patch of feathers missing from her neck that made her look like she had survived an argument she probably shouldn't have entered in the first place. Another walked with a heavy, rhythmic lean to the left so consistent you could have used her shoulder to measure a slope on a gravel barn ramp. Clellum Vance had spent 34 years standing on a wooden crate behind that podium. He knew what sold and what didn't. He knew the precise humidity at which cattle buyers started getting cranky. He knew the sound of a room that was going to bid and the sound of a room that was going to stand there with its hands shoved deep into its pockets. By 9:15 that cold Tuesday morning, the air inside the barn smelled of damp straw, stale tobacco, and low expectations. He already knew which sound this was going to be. Then Clara Vance walked in through the side sliding door. She was 23 years old. She had driven 11 miles from her late grandfather's place on Coldwater Ridge in a 2004 Ford Ranger that lost its power steering fluid every 40 miles. The driver's side door required 2 sharp kicks from the heel of a boot to unlatch from the inside, and the engine sounded like it was composing its own obituary somewhere around the 3rd mile. She wore an oversized canvas coat with frayed cuffs, muddy work boots, and had $22 in rolled bills tucked into the small coat pocket of her jeans. 3 weeks prior, the daily newspaper in Louisville, where she had spent 2 years color-correcting digital photographs, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Her apartment lease ended 5 days later. When she called her grandmother, Martha Vance, the answer had been brief and dry. There's a squeaky bed and 4 acres of broom sage that's gone to hell if you want something to keep your hands busy. Clara had not come back intending to farm, she had come back intending to figure out what came next. What came next turned out to be 53 crooked chickens in the bed of an old pickup on a cold Tuesday morning in October. She looked at those 53 crooked chickens for about 4 minutes, without saying a word. Clellum Vance watched her from across the auction rail. He had seen that look before, but usually on men twice her age. And usually it meant they were about to make a mistake they would be explaining to their wives for an entire season. "What will you take for all of them?" Clara asked, her voice calm and flat. Clellum blinked. "All of them?" Clara nodded once. "Every single one." Clellum looked at the crates, then at her, then at the 2 other men standing near the back of the barn near the coffee machine, who had drifted in on the off chance something cheap would come up. Both of them were watching now, both of them already deciding what to think. $15, Clellum said, his voice flat and bored. $15 takes the lot. Take them home, or they go straight to the rendering truck before sundown. Clara reached into her coat. She counted out a $10 bill and 5 crumpled ones right there on the wooden auction rail. Clellum took the cash. He looked at the money in his hand for a moment, like he was waiting for it to do something unexpected. Then he nodded and went to tear off the lot receipt. The 2 men near the back didn't wait. One of them, a wide-shouldered man named Harlan Cobb, who farmed 450 acres of hybrid corn down in the bottomland and had opinions about most things in Callaway County, leaned toward the other and spoke loud enough for Clara to hear. "She bought every crooked bird in the county," Harlan said, taking a slow sip from his styrofoam coffee cup. "That's either brave or stupid, and I know which one I'm betting my winter crop on. You're better off buying a sack of lime and burying your money in the garden, girl." "Those aren't chickens. That's just bird food with a limp." The other man laughed softly. Clara did not look at Harlan. She did not offer an explanation. She folded her receipt, tucked it into her pocket, and began loading the heavy wire crates into the bed of her Ranger. She secured the tailgate with an old ratchet strap, wiped her dirty hands on her canvas trousers, and stepped into the cab. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's begin. The Vance place on Coldwater Ridge had not been an operating farm since November of 2021, when Clara's grandfather, Elias Vance, dropped his tractor key into a coffee tin on the kitchen windowsill, sat down in his armchair, and simply stopped breathing. He left behind 4 acres of hard scrabble hill land, a barn that leaned 7 inches off plumb toward the west, and a house with floorboards that groaned in 3 different keys, depending on the humidity. Clara's grandmother, Martha Vance, was 76 years old. She moved through the rooms with the unhurried precision of a woman who had long since learned that wasting motion only brought on the arthritis sooner. She kept the wood stove fed, paid the electric bill on the 12th of every month, and cooked a pot of pinto beans with bacon ends every Sunday afternoon. She had watched the wild fescue and dandelion take over the south pasture without saying a word, because expressing an opinion required breath, and Martha saved her breath for things that could actually be mended. When Clara pulled up the gravel driveway at noon, the Ranger's muffler gave one final metallic clank before dying. Martha stepped out onto the porch wearing her flannel housecoat and a pair of scuffed leather work boots. She stood there, resting her hands on the porch rail, staring down at the wire crates stacked in the truck bed. "What's wrong with them?" Martha asked, her voice raspy from 40 years of damp Kentucky mornings. Clara unlatched the tailgate. "Nothing's wrong with them. They're just built different." Martha walked down the 3 wooden steps, her boots crunching in the loose gravel. She peered into the top crate, eyeing the pullet with the crooked beak, then the one dragging her left claw, and finally the hen missing half her neck feathers. "Built different," Martha repeated, her tone carrying the dry weight of a woman who had heard every excuse known to Callaway County, and found none of them particularly useful. "They were cheap, I take it?" $15 for the lot, Clara said. Martha nodded once. That part made sense to her. "The old coop behind the corn crib still has a roof on it. The latch is rusted, but there's a pair of pliers on the workbench." She turned around and walked back toward the porch. "Don't let them near my tomato beds if you expect to eat supper tonight." The coop had been built by Elias Vance in 1982, out of rough sawn white oak and corrugated tin. It had survived 44 winters by being low to the earth and stubborn about staying there. Clara spent the next 3 hours cleaning out 3 years of accumulated cobwebs, dried leaves, and dry rot straw. Her palms grew red and raw against the rough handle of the barn broom. The air inside the coop was thick with the dust of old pine shavings and the faint, sweet smell of aged timber. In the corner of the tool shed, sitting on a shelf above a box of rusted masonry nails, Clara found Elias's ledger. It was a hardcover notebook with a grease-stained canvas cover, its spine held together by 3 strips of faded electrical tape. She opened it to a random page from May 1989. In tight penciled script, her grandfather had written, "Land doesn't care about pedigree. Land only remembers who stayed when the wind got cold. What the town throws away is usually what has the marrow left in it." Clara touched the faded graphite with her thumb, then tucked the book into her coat pocket. By 4 p.m., she opened the wire crate doors. The 53 crooked chickens did not rush out. They stepped onto the fresh oak shavings with hesitant, deliberate movements. The pullet, with the misaligned beak, immediately tilted her head sideways, inspecting a grain of cracked corn near the water trough, before snapping it up with a sharp, sideways flick of her neck. The leaning hen, whom Clara found herself privately thinking of as Anchor, limped straight to the sunniest patch of dirt near the south window and began preening her feathers with complete indifference to her new surroundings. The bird missing her neck feathers, a scrappy little hen Clara, quietly named Rook, didn't waste a second. She marched past the others, squeezed through a gap in the bottom wire, and began scratching vigorously in the damp earth near the water barrel. By the end of the first week, Clara knew the daily rhythm of every broken bird in the yard. By the end of the second week, she had stopped seeing their deformities altogether. She saw their habits. Anchor always led the flock to the creek bottom at 7:15 a.m., Rook was always the last one to roost at dusk, staying out until the blue light turned completely black to catch the late-emerging beetles along the fence line. Clara did not name the rest. She knew better than to treat livestock like pets. But as she watched them move across the rocky slope of Coldwater Ridge, picking through the gravel and thriving on what other breeders considered scrap, she realized something simple. These birds weren't dying. They were adapting with an absolute silent tenacity. By late November, the frost had laid down a hard white crust over the broom sage on Coldwater Ridge. The commercial poultry houses down in the bottomland turned on their propane heaters, blowing dry, forced air over tens of thousands of white birds penned in sawdust. Clara Vance didn't have propane heaters. She had 4 acres of rocky hillside, 3 cords of split white oak, and 53 chickens that had never known a heated building in their lives. She rose every morning at 5:30 a.m., before the sun cleared the black outline of the Pine Ridge. Her daily routine was non-negotiable. She refilled the galvanized waterers, breaking the quarter-inch skim of ice with the heel of her hand. She mixed scratch grain with dried kelp and crushed limestone. She bought in 40-pound sacks from the feed store. But the grain was only a supplement. The birds spent 8 hours a day ranging across the rocky terrain, picking through the frozen leaf litter, scraping up wild garlic roots, dormant beetle grubs, and the mineral-rich clay along Coldwater Creek. The physical strain of the lifestyle began to show on Clara. Her skin grew weathered and dry from the bitter ridge wind. Her palms developed thick yellow calluses from hauling water buckets and mending chicken wire. When she looked in the small mirror above the bathroom sink, she no longer saw the city editor, who had spent 12 hours a day sitting under fluorescent lights color-correcting photographs of other people's lives. She saw a woman whose nails were permanently stained with dark creek soil and whose knuckles were red from the cold. By January, the eggs began in earnest. They were not the uniform bleach-white eggs sold in plastic cartons at the big-box supermarket 20 miles away. Nothing about Clara's flock was uniform. The shells ranged from deep mahogany brown to pale cream, with a few hens laying eggs of an almost muted olive green. When Clara cracked one open into Martha's heavy cast-iron skillet, the yolk didn't spill out flat and watery. It sat high and firm, an intense, brilliant marigold orange that almost looked artificial. "That's butterfat and wild clover," Martha observed one morning, leaning over the stove with her wooden spoon. "Store birds don't lay yolks like that. Store birds lay water." Clara started selling the eggs at the end of the driveway in a weathered cedar crate. She painted a piece of scrap plywood with white house paint. "Coldwater Ridge eggs. 3 a dozen." She placed a clean glass mason jar inside the box for the money. The first week she sold 4 dozen. The second week, 7. By February, neighbors from down the ridge were stopping their pickup trucks before 8:00 a.m. just to make sure they got a carton before the box was empty. In March, she took 30 dozen extras to Caudill's General Store on Route 119. The store had been owned by Boyd Caudill for 42 years. Boyd was 64, had a mustache that drooped over his upper lip, and possessed a long-standing reputation for never buying anything he couldn't resell in 3 days. Boyd looked at the egg cartons, opened one, and inspected the varied colors. He didn't ask about the chickens' pedigrees. He knew Clara's grandfather, and he knew the land she was working. $3 a dozen, Clara said, standing straight across the oak counter. Boyd didn't flinch. "I'll take 20 dozen to start. Bring more Tuesday if the shelf is bare." When Clara returned the following Tuesday, the shelf was completely empty. Boyd didn't say a word. He simply slid $60 across the counter and held up 5 fingers to indicate he wanted 35 dozen next time. The real test came on a rainy Thursday morning in mid-April at the Callaway County Co-op. Clara had driven down to buy 2 bags of oyster shell and a new roll of hardware cloth. As she carried a 40-pound sack toward the counter, she bumped into Dennis Ferris. Dennis was 28, ran a modern 300-head hog operation down in the creek bottom, and served as the vice president of the local Young Farmers Association. Dennis looked at the dirt on Clara's coat, then at the old Ford Ranger parked outside, and finally at Clara. "Heard you're selling eggs at Boyd's place," Dennis said, his tone carrying that specific kind of condescension reserved for small-scale operations. "Heard you bought that lot of auction rejects last fall." "I did," Clara said, setting the feed sack down on the counter. Dennis shook his head, leaning against the cash register. "Eggs are fine for pin money, Clara, But you can't build a real farm on broken stock. You can't show them, you can't breed them up to standard, and you can't sell them to any commercial processor. You're pouring good grain into a dead end. Literally nothing useful comes from nothing useful. Two older farmers standing near the tool rack quieted down, listening. Clara looked Dennis straight in the eye. Her voice was completely steady, carrying neither anger nor defensiveness. I'll let you know how it goes, Dennis. She paid for her oyster shell, picked up the 40-pound sack without asking for help, and walked out into the April rain. By late May, the flock had reached an age where 3 of the older hens and 4 surplus cockerels had stopped laying and begun to slow down. In a commercial barn, they would have been discarded into a culling bin without a second thought. But on Coldwater Ridge, nothing was wasted. On a damp Saturday morning, Clara processed 2 of the older birds herself behind the tool shed, using the clean, quick method her grandfather had noted in his ledger back in 1985. She salted the meat overnight in an earthenware crock stored in the cool darkness of the cellar. The following evening, Martha lit the wood-burning kitchen stove. She didn't use a pressure cooker or a modern Teflon pan. She brought out a heavy 8-quart iron Dutch oven that had belonged to her mother. Clara watched as her grandmother seared the chicken pieces in rendered lard until the skin turned a deep, crackling golden brown. Martha added coarse sea salt, cracked black pepper, sprigs of wild thyme gathered from the rocky pasture, sliced sweet onions, and 2 cups of rich creek water stock. She reduced the heat, put the heavy iron lid on, and let it simmer low and slow for 3 solid hours. At 6:10 p.m. Martha lifted the lid. The steam that rose from the pot filled the entire kitchen, not with the thin, greasy smell of store-bought poultry, but with a deep, rich herbal aroma that smelled like soil, wild pasture, and concentrated life. Martha dropped spoonfuls of fresh buttermilk dumpling dough onto the bubbling surface, covered the pot for 20 minutes, and then set 2 heavy ceramic bowls on the wooden table. Clara took her first bite. The meat was remarkably dense, deeply savory, and possessed a flavor so rich it made her pause with her fork halfway to her mouth. "This isn't like any chicken I've ever eaten," Clara said, looking across the table at her grandmother. Martha wiped her mouth with a cloth napkin. "That's because those birds spent 8 months running up and down the limestone ridge, eating grasshoppers, wild onions, and quartz gravel. A bird that moves builds real muscle. A bird that sits in a cage builds water and fat. Your grandfather always said you can taste whether an animal lived a real life or just waited to die." Clara sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the empty bowl. The idea didn't come to her like a sudden bolt of lightning. It arrived like the slow, steady settling of silt in a clear stream. She spent the next 2 weeks experimenting. She processed 6 more birds, refining the recipe, timing the braise down to the minute, and mastering the buttermilk dumplings until they absorbed the rich, savory broth, without losing their fluffy texture. On the second Sunday in June, Clara packed 12 heavy, insulated glass containers filled with piping hot chicken stew into cooler boxes. She loaded a folding wooden table, paper bowls, napkins, and a hand-lettered wooden sign into the back of her Ranger, and drove down to the Callaway County Farmers Market, a parking lot of the old hardware store on Main Street. Her sign read simply, "Coldwater Ridge pastured chicken stew and dumplings, $9 a bowl." For the first 45 minutes, nobody stopped. People walked past her table buying tomatoes, wild honey, jams, and hand-carved wooden spoons. Clara stood behind her table in her canvas coat, hands in her pockets, completely unhurried. At 9:15 a.m., a middle-aged woman wearing walking shoes stopped. She sniffed the air, looked at the hand-painted sign, and then looked at Clara. "Whose chickens?" she asked. "Mine," Clara replied, "pastured on Coldwater Ridge, 8 months on grass, bugs, and spring water. Can I try a bowl?" Clara lifted the heavy iron lid of her holding pot, ladled out a thick portion of golden broth, tender chicken, and a fluffy dumpling, and handed it over with a wooden spoon. The woman took a bite, closed her eyes for 3 seconds, and didn't say a word. She immediately reached into her purse. "Give me 3 more containers to take home to my husband." A man standing nearby watched the interaction, bought 1 bowl out of curiosity, sat down on the tailgate of his truck, and ate it in silence. Before he finished his last bite, he walked back to Clara's table and ordered 2 more for his neighbors. By 10:45 a.m., Clara was completely sold out. Not just sold out, there were 7 people standing in a line that stretched past the honey vendor's booth, waiting for a pot that was already wiped clean. Clara drove home with $108 in cash tucked into her pocket, her heart beating with a quiet, solid rhythm. When she told Martha her grandmother didn't cheer or make a grand scene, she simply reached for her wooden mixing bowl and said, "You'll need a bigger pot for next Sunday." By July, the line in front of Clara's table was forming at 8:30 a.m., half an hour before the market officially opened. People weren't just buying lunch, they were texting her on Friday nights asking to reserve bowls in advance. Boyd Cottle stopped by one Sunday morning, bought 2 bowls, ate them while standing near his truck, and told Clara, "People are talking about this stew all the way down in Murray. They say it tastes like supper used to taste 50 years ago." The second week of October brought a heavy wet frost that turned the oak leaves on Coldwater Ridge the color of rusted iron. Clara Vance was set up behind her folding wooden table by 8:15 a.m. at the Sunday Farmers Market. The line had already formed 6 deep in the chill morning air. People stood wrapping their coats tight around themselves, clutching paper plates and wooden spoons, waiting patiently for the smell of simmering wild thyme, rich chicken broth, and fresh buttermilk dumplings to rise from Clara's heavy iron pots. Near the back of the line stood Harlan Cobb. He didn't make a scene, he didn't push forward, or use his position as one of Callaway County's largest landowners to cut ahead. He waited his turn for 20 minutes, his large, calloused hands shoved deep into the pockets of his brown canvas duck jacket. When he finally stepped up to the table, he looked down at the steaming iron pot, then up at Clara. "2 bowls, Clara," Harlan said. His voice lacked the booming, boastful edge it had carried at the auction barn a year ago. It was flat, quiet, and measured. "That'll be $18, Harlan," Clara said, her tone completely neutral. He handed her a crisp $20 bill and told her to keep the change. He took his 2 containers, walked over to the tailgate of his late-model Chevrolet pickup, sat down on the lowered steel, and ate. Clara watched him between serving other customers. He ate slowly, thoughtfully, taking small bites of the dense, flavorful meat and dipping the fluffy dumpling into the dark golden broth. When he finished both bowls, he wiped his mustache with a paper napkin, tossed the empty containers into a trash barrel, and walked back to her table. "I spent 30 years thinking a chicken was just a machine for converting corn into pounds of water," Harlan said, resting one heavy forearm on the edge of her table. "I thought if it wasn't built straight, it wasn't worth the feed." Clara stayed silent, waiting. Harlan looked down at his boots, then back at Clara. He unbuttoned his top coat pocket, pulled out his worn cap, and held it in his hand, a quiet, unannounced gesture of respect. "I was wrong, Clara. Your grandfather knew something about this ground that the rest of us forgot when we brought in the feed trucks and the concrete floors. You can't fake flavor that comes from a real life." He paused, looking toward the ridge in the distance. "I've got 25 acres of brushy hill pasture along the north line of my place. Good water, plenty of shade, oak trees, and wild berries. It's too steep for my tractors, so it's just sitting there going to weed. If you need more range for those birds, it's yours, no rent. Just bring me a bowl of this stew once a month." Clara looked at Harlan for a long moment. She didn't smile triumphantly. She didn't boast. She simply nodded once. "I'll consider it, Harlan, thank you." He put his cap back on, touched the brim, and walked quietly back to his truck. That evening, after the sun had dipped behind Coldwater Ridge and the 53 crooked hens had settled onto their oak roosts for the night, Clara sat at the kitchen table. The house was quiet save for the gentle ticking of the wall clock and the soft crackle of the wood stove. She pulled out her grandfather Elias's canvas-bound ledger and opened it to the very last page. Under the final entry, from 1991, Clara picked up a pencil and wrote in her own clear, steady script. "Value isn't something you buy at an auction. It's something you draw out of what everyone else was, too blind or too hurried to understand." The crooked ones didn't need fixing. They just needed the land, the time, and someone willing to let them work. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told what they have isn't worth the trouble. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever checked something everyone else had already written off, I want to hear what you found. Every comment gets read. Everyone.